cut off.
Yeah, nope. Just, I have recognized in my life that my capacity to multitask is very limited. And so if I'm typing something on the computer, it's hard for me to also talk, sort of like talking and walking and chewing gum at the same time, not so simple for a guy like me. All right, so this guy, Todd May, he describes himself as an atheist who rejects the supernatural, but not the people who believe in it, which is kind of interesting. So we'll have a sort of a conversation about what he imagines. And I think that, just as there are all different, there's tremendous diversity and variety within religious traditions, I think there's also tremendous diversity and variety under this catch-all phrase of atheism. Sometimes I talk with people who say they are atheists, and sometimes they seem, sometimes I get the impression that they're, in certain ways, they're more religious than I am, and in other ways, obviously, they're not. So it's a very tricky term, and so we can even talk a little bit about what it means to say that one is an atheist. And I'm happy to share with you why I've never been completely comfortable with that term. All right, so I can imagine an atheism, he says. This is him, by the way. This is the guy. Faye, and Judy, since you don't have screens, I don't know if you picked up the article, but if you didn't, he looks like a very kind of tall man with glasses and no hair. So also no beard. So. But not, I guess, not so dissimilar looking from me, I suppose, but because he has glasses and a bald head, but he's missing the beard. He says, I can imagine an atheism that believes, for instance, that there is a spiritual bond uniting all people or all living things. It's just not my atheism. Right? So right away, there's this sort of recognition that one person's atheism is not going to be the same necessarily.
You could say the same thing for Jewishness. It varies as to who thinks they're Jewish, and it varies over a lifetime.
Absolutely. I mean, people's Jewish expression will shift over time, to be sure. I thought I heard someone come in, that's why I put my mask on, but if they're not coming in, I won't bother with the mask. That's absolutely true. And it's actually interesting, right? Is that there is, it's actually interesting to think about an atheism that has a sense of a spiritual bond uniting people or living beings, because, there are a lot of Jews who would describe themselves as atheist, but do have this sort of sense of some sort of uniting spark. Right, among people and perhaps among all living things. All right, so this is a little introduction to the piece. Faye and Judy, in 5 previous interviews in this series, we've explored Buddhist, Jain, Taoist, Jewish, and Christian views, actually specifically Catholic views, I would say, on death and the afterlife. But what about those without any religious faith or belief in God? Why not, some readers have asked, interview an atheist? So we did. Today's conversation is with Todd May, the author of 16 books on philosophy, ranging from recent French thought to contemporary ethics. His books, including A Significant Life, A Fragile Life, and most recently, A Decent Life, Morality for the Rest of Us, investigate meaning, suffering, and morality. His work has been featured in episodes of the television show The Good Place, where he served behind the scenes as a philosophical consultant. All right, and I think actually that we actually, in this group, before pre-COVID, we actually looked at one of the episodes of The Good Place, which was roundly panned by the folks who watched it. So we're not going to do that again.
I'd ask, what's a philosophical consultant?
That's a good question. That show, The Good Place, right, was about basically, I think it was about limbo, if I understood it correctly, and the uh, the protagonists, I think, were demons who had to decide who was going to go to the good place and who was going to go to the bad place. And it raised a lot of philosophical questions. And there was one actually where it raised a question that we were in this group in its pre-COVID manifestation. People were interested in this particular question. At this point, of course, I don't remember what that question was, as is often the case with jokes. Sometimes you remember the jokes more than you remember the substance of the issue. So I don't recall at this point what that was about, but we could certainly look at it. All right. So, and I guess he's also written a book called Death, because that is the first. So a philosophical consultant, Sandy. Yes. So I think that he was the one who was able to bring philosophical sources for the questions that show was asking, along the lines of what's a good life, what constitutes living for the good. How do we decide upon what rules we're going to make for ourselves as we live, things like this. And so he was able to bring philosophical sources, attach these ideas to actual philosophers, so on and so forth. All right, George Yancey, in your book Death, you very clearly state, for the record, I am an atheist, which is why I don't believe in an afterlife. Cornel West is fond of saying that we will eventually become the culinary delight of terrestrial worms. So I assume you believe life ends right there, without any consciousness beyond the worms. Do all atheists subscribe to that belief? All right. So there's a lot embedded in this first question. So he claims that he doesn't believe in an afterlife because he's an atheist, which presupposes, right, that to be an atheist, as George Yancey is suggesting, right, to be an atheist means that you have no belief in an afterlife, right? Which is not to say that if you have no belief in an afterlife that you are necessarily an atheist. Now, Cornel West is a very prominent African-American philosopher. I don't know his religious affiliation, and there are and just because we acknowledge, right, that we will die and decompose doesn't mean that also does not mean that we don't have a sense of a religious belief. But so George Yancey is asking the obvious question: to be an atheist means to have no belief in the afterlife. So Todd May, first of all, says, first, George, I owe you a debt of gratitude for this series. Confronting death is one of the most important and difficult tasks that we as humans face. It has been inspiring to see the ways different traditions grapple with that task. In stating my own position, I don't speak as a representative of atheism. All right, so he doesn't want that role. He doesn't want the job that George is giving him. There can be different types of atheism, but they all have in common the denial of a supernatural deity. My own atheism involves a denial of the supernatural in all its forms. For instance, the distinction of the soul from body, the immortality of the soul, reincarnation, and so on. However, I can imagine an atheism that believes, for instance, that there is a spiritual bond uniting all people or all living things. A view like that would not require a deity, but might still be a form of atheism. It's just not my atheism. All right, so he's going to say that there's, much more atheism. There's much more to atheism than, there's just more than one flavor of atheism, right? But he says the thing that they have in common, right, is the denial of a supernatural deity. It's not the denial of supernaturalism. And I don't know, and I don't know about deity, right? Are there deities that are not supernatural? I'm not sure. Um, right. Okay, so my particular atheism commits me to thinking that those who believe in the supernatural are mistaken. It does not, however, commit me to thinking any less of them for their belief. This is an important distinction to make, one that often goes missing in discussions of atheism. So, so any thoughts on that? Well, actually, let me just finish his
Yeah, finish the paragraph and see if there's something else.
we can talk about it. It is true that there are egregious wrongs perpetrated in the name of religion. Currently, a woman's right over her body is endangered by religious zealots. On the other hand, I have been involved in grassroots political movements for decades, and some of the most courageous people I know act on their religious conviction. Hold on one second, everybody. I'm just gonna, all right, I think we're good for now. I was gonna mute everybody, but I think we can hold off. Hold on one second.
Hello. Come in, come in.
How are you?
I just muted Roz because she's reading.
Yeah, she's got maintenance.
Yeah, okay. Roz, I've muted you, so you can unmute yourself when it comes time for you to say something.
Oh, well, all right. Okay, I was gonna shut it off. Okay.
No.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. It is true that there are egregious wrongs. I said this. To take one example, right, among many, at the forefront of those risking their freedom and lives for undocumented immigrants are people of religious faith. Atheism, in short, is a view or a set of views about the supernatural. It is not a view about people who believe in the supernatural. All right. So, thoughts on this prefacing of his thoughts about this.
Atheism can change in terms of forms and ideas.
Yeah.
They don't have to be cast in stone.
Well, that's interesting, right? I mean, that would make sense, right? If atheism is a sort of a spiritual worldview, right? Every other spiritual worldview, that we call by the name of religion, right? They all change over time. They all change over the course of a person's life, and they also change, obviously, over the course of decades and centuries. So it would make sense that atheism would also shift, at least in its particulars, right? Yeah, go ahead, Naomi. Want to say something?
Yeah, because up to now, he's not really talking about what his specific brand of atheism feels about the topic. Right now, he is sort of sorting his kind of atheism out from religion and from other people's, and we're not getting to what he really feels about the particular topic.
Yeah,
he's sort of doing background here.
Right, and it's interesting, right, that we did a fair amount of background in some of the other articles that we've read, the one on Jainism and the one on Taoism, right? We did a fair amount of background, but this is kind of interesting, right? Because atheism, unlike Jainism and Taoism, at least for me, right? Atheism is something that I feel like I'm reasonably familiar with, right? I have this much background on it. Does seem a little strange. The other thing that seems a little odd here is his defensiveness, right? He's very quick, right, to say that that even though I think people who are religious are mistaken, right? I don't think that they are. I don't think that they're bad people, and I don't think any less of them, which is interesting, right? Because it does seem to presuppose that one of the shall we say basic characteristics of atheists, if not atheism, right, is a kind of intellectual superiority, right? That they sort of take for granted that they somehow know more than other people, and they're somehow better than other people because they're not tied down by a belief in the supernatural.
Yeah, but you can say that about religious people as well. That
Anyway,
as an
absolutely.
Episcopalian, I feel superior to a Catholic. As a Catholic, I feel superior to a Baptist.
Exactly. No, I think that goes without saying. It's just interesting to me that most religious people who work in an explicitly interfaith kind of a way, right? I think I would just point out, right, that we haven't heard that necessarily from as the first thing that these other people have said, right? I do believe that there was
That's true.
a passage in the article about Catholicism where I think George Yancey actually, brought this up. Catholics are purported to say that if you're Catholic, you won't show up in heaven, and the woman in question explicitly denied that. For her, I don't think she's not in a position to deny it for all Catholics, but she denied it for her. So I mean, I do think, right, that people like me who work in interfaith settings, by and large, we take for granted, right, that the other people in the interfaith setting that we're working with have that same sort of lots of roads to the top to the top of the mountain as a sort of fundamental understandings of religion, which is
Yeah, I mean, even the Pope thinks so at this point. So,
right. Go ahead. I didn't understand what you said, Damon.
Even the Pope thinks so at this point.
That appears to be the case.
The Pope's further back. They
Right.
decide.
Catholic Church might not think that, but the Pope appears to. Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
The Orthodox Jews think Jews like me are not Jewish. They have their own way of thinking.
Yeah.
And they're the top dog in their eyes.
Oh,
well,
yeah.
Satma think the Lubavitcher are crazy. They got the same thing.
Right. We would never I would never want to suggest, right, that there is any religion, right, that that does not have believers who, along with their belief in their tradition, also what goes beyond, I think, what is a reasonable statement, right, that this tradition is the best one for me, right, to the less defensible statement, right, that this tradition is the best one, in some sort of objective way, right?
Yeah.
And I think but I do think it's interesting, right, that the first thing this guy says is he's that kind of atheist, right? Which I find to be very interesting and somehow revealing, right, of a kind of tendency among atheists to claim this kind of superiority if he needs to immediately disclaim it.
Yeah.
All right, so to be continued. And I've actually heard this from people who are atheists. I mean, I have many friends who are atheists, who will make statements very opposite from this, right? They're mistrustful of people who act out of their religious faith, right? Even if that religious faith is moving these people to act for Black Lives Matter or working for immigrant rights and so on and so forth.
But so equality for women. Most religious Jews don't happen to accept that.
Right. Well, it's very interesting, right, that there are people who are very mistrustful of religious people who identify themselves as feminists and struggle for women's rights. Right. It's the and so people I have many friends who identify as both Orthodox and feminist. They even have an organization. I forget what it's called.
Yeah. Blue Greenberg's group.
Yeah, exactly. Blue Greenbergs, exactly. And so they get it from both sides. They get it from the women's rights people, and they get it from the other, more right-wing Orthodox types. So what are you going to do? All right, so let's continue here. I agree with you that atheists don't have a monopoly on not committing egregious wrongs. But I don't think that there are atheists who commit such wrongs in the name of atheism. What is your view of that? Whether atheists have committed wrongs in the name of atheism.
You're frozen.
How about thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself? The atheists are not.
Now we're talking about Russia and China, and we still aren't talking about death.
I'm with you, Naomi. I'm finding this very, very frustrating, right? And today, the Chinese government is committing genocidal acts against the Uyghurs for related reasons. Even if we lay those aside, the condescension that some prominent atheists display towards religious believers, although not nearly as grievous, is nothing to be proud of. Of course, we atheists haven't fared too well at the hands of organized religion either, right? So I would say, right, that the reason why there is this tendency among many atheists to have this sort of condescension, right, is because of the amount of condescension towards atheists in common parlance, right? It's still today, I think it's very difficult to get elected in many parts of this country if you proclaim yourself to be an atheist. So, it would have been really interesting to see what would have happened if Bernie Sanders had become the candidate, because I think he affirms his atheism, even though, of course, he is.
He's regarded as a Jew no matter what he does.
Of course, but I think the interesting question is, what would hurt him more, being Jewish or being an atheist? I really don't know. All right, Yancey, if those who believe in the supernatural are mistaken epistemologically, in the sense of knowing, right? Epistemological questions, knowing. Do you feel that you have a responsibility to tell them that they are wrong? Or is it fine to allow religious believers to embrace beliefs that you would argue are false? So again, we're not talking about death or dying here. We're talking about atheism in general, right? Along the lines of, if you're a Christian, right, and you believe that that Jesus Christ is the good news, right? Do you have a duty to evangelize the people who have not yet seen the light? This is the atheist version of that, right? To me, whether or not to argue about the correctness of belief in the supernatural is very much dependent on context. For instance, I do volunteer teaching in a maximum security prison, where faith among the incarcerated men often plays an important role in sustaining them psychologically. It would be unethical for me to try to argue that they're mistaken. They adhere to different religions. They know that I'm an atheist, so we sit around a table, or we did at least until COVID-19 arrived, and discuss philosophical ideas together, often comparing how their different beliefs might incorporate or reject these ideas, right? So he behaves as a teacher or as a chaplain, right, in these contexts, right? He's not there to just in the way that I'm not here to convince anyone to be Jewish, right? He's not there to convince anyone to be an atheist. All right, here he is again. All right, I'm committed to the existence of anything that I need to be committed to in order to explain my experience of the world, Mr. May said, which does not include explanations that are supernatural. Alternatively, if someone is using religious faith to diminish others, challenging the correctness or coherence of the faith itself might be a justified form of confrontation. And for very different reasons, a philosophical discussion of the supernatural would be a proper place to challenge religious belief. All right, so obviously there are some times when he would make those arguments, and other times where it would not be appropriate, right? right? In what way is your atheism undergirded by a naturalist approach to the world? As for naturalism, again, there are many varieties. They range from a more radical physicalist view that there is nothing but particles and forces, to something more robust involving minds, relationships, and so on. Discussions of naturalism tend to get complicated very quickly. For instance, does the monist view, the view that there is only one kind of stuff in the universe, commit us to thinking that interpersonal relationships don't exist, only material stuff? Um, so that's an interesting
well,
question. I don't find it that interesting because
Yeah.
I'm not a materialist to that extent.
Yeah, my reaction at this point is so new.
Is what, Naomi, say it again?
My reaction at this point is so new.
Yeah, exactly. My own naturalism does not require anything very radical. It is nothing more really than a denial of the supernatural. Beyond that, I would say that I'm committed to the existence of anything that I need to be committed to in order to explain my experience of the world. If that sounds vague in general, it should. It's just that I don't need anything supernatural for those explanations. My atheism follows pretty straightforwardly from that. So your denial of the supernatural in all its forms seems similar to Pierre Simon Laplace's response to Napoleon when the latter asked him about the absence of any mention of God in his system of the cosmos. Laplace said, I had no need of that hypothesis. For Laplace, at least, his response doesn't claim that God doesn't exist. It only says that he has no need for it. So your experience of the world doesn't need God or belief in a soul that survives the death of the body. However, given that your experiences are constantly open and even scientific inquiry is an open project, do you allow for the possibility that supernaturalism could come to play a more important role in your life?
I see what it's, okay.
I get the sense here that Yancey is himself avoiding the issue of death as much as May is,
Yeah,
which again I find very interesting, because I don't find this conversation so far to be that interesting, and I also am disappointed because, well, anyway, let's wait and see if, when we get to the conversation about death. Okay, so that certainly be true, although unlikely. Here's why. Our explanations of particular things or happenings are not just one-offs. They're part of a network of beliefs. If that network of belief is naturalist, then when things happen that I can't explain, I'm likely to look for naturalist ways of explaining them. Or alternatively, say that I can't find an adequate explanation for them yet. This is just as true of someone with a supernaturalist bent. For some Christians, for instance, the prevalence of evils like innocent children dying and poverty are difficult to reconcile with the existence of a benevolent deity. Rather than give up on the existence of the deity, though, one can offer a complicated explanation that preserves one's faith, or call it a mystery. None of this is to argue that significant changes in the framework of beliefs are impossible. This does happen to people who either gain or lose a religious view. Many Jews, for instance, lost their faith in the wake of the Holocaust. Instead, it is to say that naturalism and supernaturalism are more like scaffolding within which we usually test and modify our beliefs. The scaffoldings themselves are less often open to change. All right, so that is an interesting, and to me somewhat debatable proposition. But I'm interested in what you would have to say. So because losing and gaining faith, right, often happens. It does happen. In the wake of the Holocaust, I have family members who are in that category, and I know a lot of people who are in that category. But I also know people whose belief not only survived, but was given credit among people for what allowed them to survive in such terrible situations. So obviously, I'm not sure that naturalist versus supernaturalist is the only
yeah,
only issue at hand.
yeah. It's like you either, if I'm interpreting this correctly, you either believe in an afterlife, which is supernaturalism, or you don't, which is naturalism. And I'm still not sure where this is going.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I'm not even sure, uh, because because I'm not. It seems to me that people are not only naturalist or supernaturalist, unless they are exceedingly consistent with themselves. Uh,
Yeah,
I know a lot of people who describe themselves as atheists, who will invoke the supernatural at moments when uh, it feels appropriate for them to do so, um, and which is an interesting uh, it's an interesting mix, I think. And I know plenty of people who are quite religious, right? Who have no, not only no objection, right, to a naturalist uh, view of the world, but actually in most of the things that happen in the world, they are excessively naturalist, right? That people. I know a lot of people who are very religious who don't use faith healing, right, as their primary uh, 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 source of medical care, right? Um, Plenty of people are able to hold in their heads, right, various stories about the creation of the world, and also recognize that there are naturalist explanations for the creation of the world, and that they wouldn't want to be forced to choose between them and only have one account, right, of how the world was created. And so, because the naturalist account and the supernaturalist account are doing different things for them in their lives. I'm not buying uh, this stark bifurcation. But I don't know about you.
yeah, so really where he seems to be dancing around the idea that to be an atheist, you cannot believe in an afterlife. Uh, I think that's where he's going.
Yeah.
But again, it's
He denied that at the beginning. I mean, Yancey asks him this, right? Is
yeah,
this what all atheists believe? And he said, no, not all atheists believe that. All atheists believe that there's no
yeah.
supernatural.
But where he seems to be going
Right.
is
But it does seem to me, right, that if you reject all, I mean, and it's interesting to me to think about what does it mean to reject all supernatural explanations for things, right?
we still haven't defined supernatural.
Right. 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 So does that mean that? I mean, for instance, does it mean to him, right, that reading the Bible um, is is at best a waste of time, and at worst, sort of, deceiving yourself about the nature of the world? I don't know what his response would be to that.
Hmm.
So, all right, so let's continue. From what you've said thus far, you are not trying to proselytize others to reject supernaturalism. Yet your rejection of an afterlife must be more than, say, a rejection of blueberry pie, where this is just a question of taste. So, apart from taste, why should or shouldn't those who are believers in the afterlife or in God continue to believe such things? Then this gets completely ridiculous. Hey, how did you know that I'm not keen on blueberry pie? I never told you that. Blueberry
Yeah,
pie aside, however, it's not just a question of taste. For those who take up the religious view, or at least take it seriously, the presence of the supernatural in their lives helps orient how they think about their place in the universe and how they live. It also affects how they think about their death. It isn't a question of taste for them, it's a question of the universe and their place and role in it. The same is true for me and my naturalism. I believe with some of the existentialists that we're not here for any particular cosmic reason or purpose. We just show up, live our lives, and then die. This doesn't mean, of course, that I don't believe in things like morality. Rather, I ground morality and values in another way. In fact, I've written a book on meaningfulness in life. it also means that my relation to my death is different. All right, so he's saying something about he's saying something about religious people, right? Which is that the supernatural helps orient them to their place in the universe and how they live, and also about their death, right? And he also, which is interesting, right? That he focuses on that, and then when he talks about himself, right? He denies that there's any meaning beyond the life that he is living, right? Or that each one of us lives, right? There's no
Yeah.
great purpose to our lives. And then interestingly, right, is that where he goes is then to the question of morality, right? So he no longer, so he there is he our place in the universe, right, according to him, is, well, there, we're like a mosquito, right? We're the same as the mosquito, or any other any other animal. To pick your favorite animal, right? Our lives are no more meaningful or important.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you do not necessarily have to believe in an afterlife to see things that need to be done and going out and doing them
Right.
without feeling that, oh, this is going to store me credit in heaven.
Right. Exactly.
It's,
And it's interesting, right? I mean, I wish he would. He says he's written a book on how to make meaning in a life where you reject any larger purpose for human life. Usually that's generally the way that people begin to make meaning out of their lives, right? Is that they see their lives in a larger context, right? And they often are able to see a larger purpose to their life, right? For instance, I became a chaplain in part because it was consistent with how I see myself and the kind of life that I feel like I was called to live. I don't consider myself a particularly supernatural person, right? But I do have this sense of something larger than me, that I'm confused. I am kind of interested maybe to have a look at his book and try to figure out, well, how do you make a meaningful life when you sort of deny the larger meaning of life? So it's an interesting book.
let's say I'm not about to rush out and buy the book.
No, buy it? No way. Maybe I would get it in the library. All right. So as an atheist, how do you deal with the fact that you will die? All right. Finally, we get to this point, as we all will at some point. There's a paradox here, one which I wrote about in my book on death. On one hand, our death threatens to sap meaning from our lives. Okay? Why is this? We live oriented towards our future. Our most important engagements, career, relationships, hobbies, etc., presuppose future development. Death would cut us off from those developments and thus some of the meaning of our engagements. And it is important to note that because we can die at any time, that threat is a constant one. We live under the shadow of death. All right. So I'm not sure here first of all, I'm not really sure that this is a paradox, or maybe I guess we don't have the other hand of the paradox. But this does not seem particularly controversial. On one hand, on the other hand, I really think that all of our that we don't only live looking forwards.
Yeah.
Right? I think a lot of the meaning that we make out of our lives, right, especially as we grow older, is by figuring out how to make meaning out of the path that our lives have taken. It's just and just to use myself as an example, and I would be happy to to hear other people on this also. It took me some amount of time to figure out the twists and turns of my professional career, and it's very it has been very interesting to think about how all those twists and turns uh, turned into a kind of a not quite coherent whole, but a whole nonetheless. And so whatever I'm thinking about for the future is very, very clearly uh, influenced and given greater meaning by the past. Just to give a very small example, if I didn't speak Russian, I wouldn't have the job. I would never have gotten the jobs that I've done in my life. And I didn't set out to get jobs that had speaking Russian as a prerequisite, but it just turned out that way. So that's something I can't explain entirely from a completely naturalist perspective unless I just go with coincidence, which is
Yeah.
also
And the idea we live under the shadow of death. I mean, maybe he does, but
right. I mean, I feel like I live under the shadow of life. I mean, certainly death is real, and I deal with it all the time because of the nature of my work. But it doesn't take life away from me. I would say the opposite, right? That the more acquainted I've become with death, and the more that I live with it in a kind of a day-to-day way, it makes me feel even more alive in some very interesting way. But that's again, so there are several things here that um, uh, don't speak to me. On the other hand, without mortality, so this is the other side of it, right? Without mortality, our lives would eventually become shapeless. If we lived forever, as some philosophers have pointed out, it would be difficult to sustain our enthusiasm for even many of our most significant engagements. To see why, we need to recognize how long immortality lasts. Here is one scenario that is used to see this. Imagine a desert the size of the Sahara. Every 10,000 years, a bird comes along and plucks a single grain of sand from the desert. By the time the Sahara has been cleared, not a single flicker of immortality would have passed. So again, this seems like a very, he's not wrong, I wouldn't say, but I don't think it's just mortality, right, that gives our life, that gives our relationship to death meaning, I guess you would say.
yeah.
It's not just the fact that we will die, right?
But most of us don't consider the fact that we will die.
Right. Many people, I do think you're right, Sandy. I think that many people think that if we spend time thinking about the fact that we're going to die, right, that will doom us to living under the shadow of death, the way that he
Yeah.
said it, right?
Yeah.
And I would love to be more of an effective proselytizer. I think that I am for the idea that that looking death in the face is actually a very life-affirming thing to do, but it's not an easy argument to make. So how do we live with this paradox? I suggest we seek to live along two registers at once. First, we must engage in forward-looking projects and engagements because that's inevitable for almost all human beings. A life without ongoing engagements is, for most people, an impoverished one. And I would agree with that, and I think that that's actually one of the most difficult aspects, at least again for me personally, of COVID, right? Is that it has there are certain aspects of my life, right, that have feel like they've kind of stopped. Other things are going along, as quickly as they always have, but other things have kind of slowed down, and that is it's very difficult. Second, we must try to live as best we can within the moments of those engagements. Instead of solely looking forward, we should enjoy the present of what we do in the knowledge that at any moment the future could disappear. It's a kind of stereoscopic.
Now he's being a Buddhist.
Yeah, non-attachment, right? This is non-attachment, right? It's kind of stereoscopic vision that seeks to orient toward the future while immersing in the present, right? On the other hand, I would say that most religious traditions, right, have some form, right, of being present in the moment, right? That it's part of engaging in a spiritual reality, whether it's theist or atheist, right, is being present in the current moment.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't think that doing this is easy. For my own part, living more fully in the present is difficult for me. But I've gotten to the stage of my life where I can see its far shore much more clearly than the shore I set out from. And so I'm trying to do that with greater urgency. Now, what do you got? Well, what do you think? Do you think that is this hard to do, or is it not hard to do?
Yeah,
Is what hard to do?
yeah,
Living in the
exactly. Exactly. That's- the other thing is, I'm sorry, Sandy, I'm interrupting you.
No, that's fine.
We are not yet here clearly distinguishing between what might be atheism and what might be agnosticism.
Yes.
And
That's a good point.
might have been useful in here someplace.
Yeah, and this is why, I mean, you're putting your finger, Naomi, on my problem with this word atheism, right? Because I'm far from a theist, right? A person who posits the existence of a God that's separate, from the world, right? But I'm also not very comfortable with atheist, right, from the perspective that it suggests and this is what he gets to, right? It's an epistemological claim,
Yeah.
right, of certainty that there is no God that makes me no less uncomfortable than claiming certainty that there is a God.
Yeah.
And as soon, and I do think, right, that the more obnoxious atheists, Richard Dawkins and what's the other guy's name? The guy that died of cancer, he wrote that beautiful book about mortality. Hitchens, Christopher Hitchens. At the very least, along with their obnoxiousness, right, was a kind of, they have the courage of their convictions. They are atheists and they're certain about it, which makes their arguments sort of prima facie untenable, but neither here nor there, right? So Yancey asks here, as an atheist, is there something that you know about death that the other religious orientations covered thus far in the series of interviews ought to know about death? And May, again, he's very slippery. He doesn't want to say anything. It's so interesting. It would be very hard to call it a matter of knowing, since I'm pretty sure there is no afterlife, and some of the other religious orientations in the interviews think they know otherwise. Instead, I would put it this way: except for the most devout among us, even those who think there may be an afterlife have their moments of doubt. My view offers a way to confront, although not overcome, death in the wake of that doubt. I'm not sure.
Well, I'm glad he realizes he can't overcome it.
Right. And I don't understand exactly. Again, I'm not sure that I'm buying this, right? Because it feels to me that that there are very few nuanced religious thinkers who don't sort of take for granted the importance of doubt, along with faith, right? It's that they go together.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that I need. I don't know that I need a rejection of the afterlife, even though I don't necessarily affirm it. But I don't think I need to reject it in order to feel like I can confront death. All right, so Yancey, I must ask this. Let us assume that the nature of reality is not exhaustible by an explanatory network of beliefs undergirded by naturalism. What if upon your death, consciousness survives? That is, supernaturalism is true. Any thoughts? If I imagine waking up as something still recognizably me in the afterlife, I think my first thought would be, I hope there's no blueberry pie here. So he seems very, I'm again dissatisfied by this response, right?
Satisfied by the question.
Yeah, the question is not that helpful either. It feels to me like these are this feels like a very, I'm not sure, very unsatisfying article. I have to,
Yeah,
I have
yeah.
to say.
If the one thing he's worrying about is blueberry pie, he's given himself away. That's the worst thing that can happen to him. He's okay.
He's what? He's what, Sandy?
Then it's ridiculous.
Yeah,
If that's
Yeah.
the worst thing he can imagine is blueberry pie,
I think he's being satirical.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I mean, I think he's dodging the question.
Yeah, consistently.
He's dodging the question because he doesn't seem to be able to imagine that, right? You know, the thought that the thought that he might be wrong, right, is so fantastical to him that he can only respond in this
Yeah.
kind of dismissive.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the bunch of Schweik syndrome again.
It's the what?
it's what?
The bunch of Schweik.
Bunch of spy.
Yeah.
I grew up as a child.
Yeah, but you know,
for
he's
much of my life
thinking
very
about
religious.
blueberry pie. The other guy with all of the glories of heaven spread out before him can only think about a hot roll with butter.
I remember being a freshman at college, and one of the professors said he didn't believe in God. And I couldn't believe that, and he didn't fall down dead on the spot. I still remember that. It just blew my mind. He was my math professor, Eric Goldman.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
this is not an article that gives you a great deal of ability to know what this particular atheist even feels about that.
Right, and I'm trying to figure out, right, one of the reasons why I would not be necessarily opposed to reading a few pages of him not in conversation with George Yancey, right, is because I do think that it's hard for me to imagine that his worldview is quite as shallow as presented here.
Yeah,
Yeah. But on the other hand, you know, I mean, you know, when I've read a little bit of this, you know, the so-called new atheists, and the problem with their writing is by and large that they're so, it's kind of like the blueberry pie question. They're so assured of the correctness of their views that they don't write in a kind of searching, they don't do theology, right? And what you really need, I think, to be an effective atheist, not effective, but like, you know, you really have to do the kind of theology that religious people do and really hold up your beliefs to questions, to objections, to the darkness that they might and by and large I don't see that happening.
yeah.
And yet he got to be a professor of philosophy at Emory, so that kind of undercuts.
That's Yancey. That's Yancey. Now I don't know where May.
Oh, that's not May. Okay.
May is an author and a television consultant. So I mean, maybe that's part of the problem. I mean, maybe he really is kind of an armchair philosopher, and Yancey is doing everyone a disservice by bringing, you know, a person who's essentially a popular, you know, a writer of popular, you know, pop atheism, you know, in the same group that he, you know, the other people that he's interviewed have by and large been very heavy duty scholars and religious thinkers. So it might be that it's not a fair fight. So I think it would be more interesting to, I wish he had chosen a different atheist.
Yeah. No, you're right.
This is not the atheist you're looking for.
You know, may I say something?
Please,
I'm
Barbara.
sorry I came late. I got confused about the day. I said, oh, 2:30 is perfect. Oops, I made an error. So at least I dropped in. I was married to a philosophy professor, and they think differently, the same as mathematicians. Everybody thinks differently, and they may cluster in their the area that they're in for reason.
Yeah.
Because they want to know. I mean, with philosophy, you do a lot of readings of other philosophers, and you go into it frequently to find out why things happen to you.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
I
I
mean,
don't think you can lump philosophy professors as a group.
yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I've known some academic philosophers in my life, and they are their own breed, just like theologians are, and um, and there are sort of personality traits that often cluster. But that being said, it feels to me as though I also feel in this article, I also feel Yancey's sort of discomfort with atheism, and I along with Naomi, I also have. I'm not sure if I would have asked different questions, but I'm not. I don't know if I can put my finger on why I didn't like his questions so much, but I didn't find his questions to be open up the kind of
Exactly.
kind of
His questions did not elicit the kind of answers that were implied
right. Right.
that he was looking, that the whole construct implied he was looking for.
Yeah. Oh, yes. I live with some of that. Well, you're not telling whatever, and and I said, no, I'm not. It was interesting living with this logic and reason, but it's their idea of logic and reason.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you for trying.
And I thought
I did read the article first, by the way.
Good. Yeah, I thought it would be interesting at least to raise some of these questions. And hopefully we'll have the next one will be a little bit more successful. But I'm glad we had this conversation.
Anyway, thank you for trying.
Thank you very much.
Live
All right.
long and prosper and whatever all else.
Yeah.
Barbara, if you want to hear what we had to say about the article, feel free to look at it on YouTube. It'll be available in just a minute.